One afternoon in February of 2007, a man walked nervously across an icy parking lot. He was heading towards the front door of a police station in Merrillville, Indiana. This man had just been arrested, and he was being brought in for processing. But he had this hope, a strong belief, really, that he wouldn't be there for long. He thought he'd be allowed to leave almost immediately. And that's because he had a piece of information, a huge piece of information, about a murder case that had been cold for 4 years. He was planning to trade this information for his own freedom. And even though he was a little nervous it might not work, deep down, he was pretty confident it would. Because this wasn't just some small tip he was offering. This was a bombshell that would blow the whole case wide open. On the afternoon of the 17th of April, 2003, a 33-year-old man named John Parker Jr. was sitting at his desk. He was in his office at J&J Parker Industries, right there in Merrillville, Indiana. He was trying to get through a stack of paperwork, and he was really hoping for just a few minutes of uninterrupted quiet time to finish it. In John's world, finding a few quiet minutes was a rare thing. John was the owner of J&J, which was a consulting company. They trained people on how to sell high-end vacuums. Now, vacuums might not sound very glamorous, but John's company was incredibly successful, and running it was a massive amount of work. He was constantly on his feet, managing a team of about 25 employees, solving one problem after another. He almost never got a quiet moment to sit down and do things like paperwork. And even though John would sometimes complain about how busy he was, the truth is, he loved it. He had always been a hard worker, a real go-getter. He actually started out in the vacuum business as a door-to-door salesman. And back then, everyone told him there was no real money to be made in vacuums. But John was determined to prove them wrong, and he did. He was so good at sales, so naturally talented, that he made his first $1 million by the time he was just 30 years old. And now, just a few years later, he had his own company that taught other people how to be just as successful as he was. But right now, as John was trying to focus on his paperwork, his desk phone started ringing. He let out a little sigh and picked it up. It was his wife, Judy. She was calling to remind him about their daughter's homework. She'd left it in his office a couple of days ago, and Judy asked him if he could please remember to bring it home with him that night. John was about to tell her that this was the second time she had reminded him about the homework today, but he caught himself. He decided not to say anything. Because right now, things between them were actually pretty good. Their relationship was on solid ground, and he didn't want to do anything to mess that up. John and Judy had been married for 10 years. She wasn't just his partner in life, she was his partner in business, too. Judy was the second J in J&J Parker Industries. Together, they were raising 4 kids. To the outside world, John and Judy looked like the perfect power couple. They were happy, successful, and had a beautiful family. But the reality was a lot more complicated than that. About a year before this, Judy had had an affair. And at the time, John had been completely devastated. But he really loved his family, and he wanted to give their marriage another chance. They had been living in Michigan when the affair happened, and they both agreed that moving the business to Merrillville, Indiana, which was where John was originally from, would be a good way to get a fresh start. And so far, it seemed like they had made the right decision. The business was thriving, things were looking up for them financially, and most importantly, John and Judy were getting along again. They were trying to rebuild their trust. So, instead of getting annoyed at his wife for the reminder about the homework, he just said, sure. He told her he'd grab it and that he would see her later for their date night. As soon as John hung up the phone with Judy, there was a knock on his office door. His office manager, a man named Barry Jones, came charging in holding a bunch of files. Barry dropped them right on John's desk and said he was sorry to interrupt, but he needed a signature right away. It was the final termination paperwork for an employee John had recently fired. The employee's name was Derek Hall. About a week earlier, John had made the tough decision to let Derek go. It wasn't anything personal against Derek, he just wasn't a good fit for the company. He couldn't seem to keep up with the sales quotas, and John had very high standards for his employees. That's how he'd become a millionaire in the first place, by setting a high bar and meeting it. But Derek hadn't taken the firing well. He seemed to think it was John's fault, that John had a personal vendetta against him. Derek had actually shown up at the J&J office and made a big scene in the parking lot. He was yelling that John had shorted him hundreds of dollars on his last paycheck. John had tried to calm the situation down, to talk to Derek rationally, but Derek had gotten physical and actually attacked him. It got so bad that the police had to be called to separate them before it got any uglier. In the end, John had just paid Derek the money he was demanding. He didn't want the drama. He just wanted the whole thing to be over with. And that's why, right now, he was quickly scribbling his signature on the termination paperwork and handing it back to Barry. He was hoping that this would be the absolute last time he would ever have to see or even think about Derek Hall again. After work, around 6 p.m., John drove home. His house was only about a 15-minute drive from the office. When he got inside, he heard Judy call down from upstairs. She said she'd be ready for their date night soon. He yelled back that there was no rush, and he meant it. You see, just a little over an hour earlier, his older brother David had met him at the office. The two of them had gone to a buffet together for a late lunch. So, John wasn't really hungry at all anymore. But he knew that this dinner with Judy was more about spending time together and reconnecting than it was about the food. So, he wasn't going to say anything about his earlier meal. John walked into the living room where his 4 kids were watching TV. There was his one 7-year-old daughter, Christina, her one 5-year-old brother, Daniel, and their 2 younger sisters. The 2 older kids were going to babysit the younger ones tonight, so he and Judy could have their night out. But when John tried to start a conversation with them, both Christina and Daniel just gave him the cold shoulder. They barely even looked at him. Now, for any other parent, this might just seem like typical teenage behavior. But for John, it felt more complicated than that. Christina and Daniel were actually his stepkids. John had been in their lives since they were very young, and he had always considered himself to be their real dad. He had tried so hard to be involved. He coached Daniel's baseball team, he went to all the school concerts, he never missed a parent-teacher conference. But recently, his relationship with both of them had changed. It had become strained. And frankly, both kids had started acting out a lot more. Christina was repeatedly throwing parties at their house whenever he and Judy were gone. And Daniel was becoming more and more combative. He was hanging out with a group of friends who seemed to be constantly in trouble with the law. And this was creating a lot of conflict in the house, specifically between them and John. Because John was the one who tried to enforce the rules and discipline them. Judy, on the other hand, always seemed to play the good cop, letting things slide. But John knew that trying to force a conversation with them right now wouldn't get him anywhere. So he just sat down quietly, and they all watched TV in silence until Judy came downstairs and announced she was ready to go. Hours later, just before 10 p.m., John and Judy left the restaurant. They got in their car and started driving back towards John's office at J&J Parker Industries. The office was located in an office park in a pretty secluded area. The two of them had had a really nice dinner. They had talked and seemed to be connecting. But during the meal, Christina had called. She wanted to know where that homework was, the homework John was supposed to bring home. And John, feeling a wave of embarrassment, suddenly realized that despite all of Judy's reminders, the same ones he was getting annoyed by earlier, he had completely forgotten the homework at the office. So that's why they were here now, making a stop to pick it up on their way home. John pulled the car into the parking lot, and they both got out. When they walked into the building, they found that the office manager, Barry, was still there, hard at work. John wasn't too surprised by this. Things had been really busy lately. They were planning new training seminars and trying to find a new hire to replace Derek. And Barry was the one in charge of keeping everything organized. John didn't feel too bad about Barry putting in all these extra hours. It was his job after all, and the whole company relied on him to make sure nothing important slipped through the cracks. So, when Barry mentioned to John that he was actually thinking about heading home soon, John told him no. At that same moment, John saw Judy grab the homework off his desk. She gave a little wave and then hustled back out to the car. As he watched her go, John turned back to Barry and told him he was sorry, but he really needed him to stay and finish what he was working on. It was important. But then, to try and soften the blow of this bad news, John offered Barry his leftovers from dinner. He had a basically untouched, full meal in a to-go box since he hadn't been hungry. Barry kind of grumbled about having to stay, but he said he would take the food if John was offering. So, John nodded and went back outside to the car to get it for him. Moments later, John was back at the car where Judy was waiting in the passenger seat. He opened the back door and picked up the styrofoam to-go box. When Judy looked over her shoulder at him, he told her he was just going to run the food back inside to Barry. She just shrugged and said, "Fine," then turned back around to face the front. But right at that exact moment, as John was closing the car door, he heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the concrete coming up right behind him. But before he even had a chance to turn around and see who it was, he heard a deafening bang. Judy heard the bang too. It was immediately followed by a second one. Her instincts took over and she ducked down in her seat. Then she looked back towards John just in time to see him fall hard to the ground. Before she could even process what was happening, before she could scream or move, she saw a person. They were dressed in dark clothes and wearing a mask. The person crouched over John's body for just a few seconds, and then they sprinted away from the car, running towards the main road and disappearing into the darkness. Judy scrambled out of the car and ran to John's side, screaming his name. But he just lay there, on the cold pavement, completely still. And then she saw it. A huge pool of dark blood was spreading out from underneath his head. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Judy ran back to the office door and screamed at the top of her lungs for Barry to call the police. By about 10:30 that night, the parking lot at J&J Parker Industries was a swarm of flashing blue and red lights. It was overrun with police officers and crime scene technicians. Among them was a man named Detective Donald Toth. He'd been with the Maryville Police Department for 21 years. When he first got the call, dispatch had only told him there had been a shooting. But as soon as he arrived on the scene, a first responder pulled him aside and told him that it was actually a fatality. The victim was 33-year-old John Parker Jr. He had been identified by the other two witnesses who were still at the scene. The first responder also explained that before they spoke to any witnesses, they had tried to find John's wallet to identify him. But the wallet wasn't in any of his pockets, and it wasn't in the car. When Toth heard that, his first immediate thought was that this was probably a robbery. But as soon as he walked over and got a closer look at John, he immediately started to question that theory. John was lying on his back behind his parked car. And the first thing Toth noticed was that John was wearing a lot of very nice, very expensive jewelry. He had gold and diamond rings on his fingers, a heavy bracelet on his wrist, and a very expensive-looking Rolex watch. Also, this office park was in a remote area. It wasn't close to anything. It just didn't seem like the kind of place where a random mugger would hang out hoping to find a victim. Toth started to wonder if maybe the killer took the wallet just to throw the police off, to make them think it was a robbery. Because the longer he looked at John's body, the more signs he saw that this was likely a planned and efficient execution. John didn't have any visible defensive wounds, which suggested he never saw it coming. And when Toth carefully used a gloved hand to move John's head to the side, he saw the gunshot wound. It was right behind his ear. Toth had actually worked as a paramedic before he became a detective, so he knew from experience that a shot like that had likely killed John instantly. It also meant that John had his back turned to the shooter when he died. There was an open styrofoam to-go container of food on the ground and a set of car keys right next to John's body. The way they were placed on the pavement made it look like John had probably been holding them when he fell. If John had been in some kind of altercation, like a struggle with a thief or a fight that ended in murder, the scene would have been much messier. As far as Toth could tell, the killer had simply walked up to John while he was distracted at his car, aimed the gun, pulled the trigger, and then, after John was on the ground, grabbed his wallet and just left. This also meant the killer very likely had not been at the scene long enough to leave behind much evidence. All Toth and his team could find were 2 shell casings on the ground. He doubted they would find any useful footprints or any DNA. And when Toth spoke to some of the other officers at the scene, he learned they had already done a sweep of the entire office park. They had looked in all the dumpsters, checked the bushes, and even looked on the roofs of the buildings. But they hadn't found anything. And there were no security cameras or surveillance systems anywhere in the area. So, as Toth stood there in the middle of the parking lot, watching his officers continue to search, he had a sinking realization. He was now the lead detective on a murder case with virtually no forensic evidence. That was a daunting position to be in, but he reminded himself that he did have at least 2 witnesses. About an hour later, Toth was sitting across a table from John Parker's wife, Judy, inside an interrogation room at the Merrillville police station. He'd learned a few basic things about Judy already. She was the one who had told Barry to call the police, and she was with John when he was shot. He also knew that as the spouse of a murder victim, she was automatically his #1 suspect. Now, Toth didn't really think Judy was the one who had pulled the trigger. But given how clean the crime scene was, he knew it was possible this was a professional hit. And if that was the case, Judy could have been the one who hired the killer. But as Toth started to speak with Judy, he began to waver on that theory. She couldn't stop crying. It was making it hard for her to even get her words out. And when she did manage to speak, her voice was slow and quiet, like it was taking every ounce of her energy just to say anything at all. She did manage to give Toth the timeline of the evening. She told him how she and John had gone out to dinner for their date night, and then they had stopped by the office afterward because one of their daughters had left some homework there. She said the office manager, Barry, had been at the office, and that after she went back to the car, she knew that Barry and John were still talking inside. Then, at some point, John had left the building and come out to the car to get his dinner leftovers. She said at that time she had turned away from him for a moment, and that's when she heard the 2 loud shots. When she turned back around, she saw John fall. And then she saw the figure in dark clothes bending over John before they ran away. However, once Judy finished telling her story about what had happened that night, all the events that led up to the shooting, something in her demeanor shifted. The shakiness in her voice, all the raw grief that had been pouring out of her, it just vanished. In its place, Judy became very stern, very hardened. She looked directly at Toth, right into his eyes, and she said, "You better find the person who did this and bring them to justice." And when Toth saw this sudden change, he almost got goosebumps. It was such a drastic departure from how she had been acting just moments before. And he thought to himself, either she is a fantastic actress and this is all just a big performance, meaning she was involved, or this is genuine. She's a grieving widow who is in shock and doesn't know how to process the fact that her husband has just been murdered in front of her. At some point during the interview, Toth asked Judy if she could think of anyone, absolutely anyone, who might have wanted to hurt John. Judy seemed to think about it for a second, but eventually she just shook her head and said, no. She said that John was an incredible husband and a wonderful father. She said they had a great marriage that they had both worked very hard on and that everyone at work respected him. But then, something seemed to click in her memory. She frowned and said, actually, there was someone from work who didn't like John. His name was Derek, and John had fired him recently. She explained that after the firing, Derek had come back to J&J and started a physical fight with John right there in the parking lot. When Toth heard that, he perked up. A disgruntled former employee was definitely someone he needed to talk to. Toth was scheduled to speak with the office manager, Barry Jones, right after he was done with Judy. So he figured he could ask Barry about that incident as well. Now, Toth wasn't ready to completely rule Judy out as a suspect. He still needed to check her finances and talk to her friends and family about the state of her marriage. But for now, he didn't see any reason to hold her. So he told Judy that she was free to go home and be with her kids, to grieve, and that they would be in touch. Then Toth got up and he left to go to another interrogation room where Barry was waiting for him. The following morning, Toth walked up a flight of porch steps. He was at the home of Derek Hall, the ex-employee that John Parker had recently fired. The night before, Toth had spoken to John's office manager, Barry Jones. Barry had confirmed what Judy had said about Derek. He verified that after Derek was fired, there had been a huge, ugly fight at the office between Derek and John, and that Derek was the one who had started it. It was really the only useful piece of information Barry had given him. Barry claimed that during the actual shooting, he had been in the bathroom, so he hadn't heard or seen anything at all until he heard Judy screaming for him. But the lead on Derek was solid enough for now. And it wasn't just Barry and Judy who thought Derek might have killed John. Just before coming here, Toth had also spoken to John's brother David. David was incredibly devastated and absolutely furious about his brother's death. And David had also pointed the finger directly at Derek. So Toth was very eager to meet this man, Derek, a man that 3 different people claimed could be a killer. Toth reached the top of the steps and knocked on the front door. When Derek answered, Toth introduced himself and explained why he was there. Derek seemed completely stunned by the news of John's murder, but he immediately let Toth inside. Moments later, Toth was sitting across from Derek in his living room. And even though Derek seemed very uncomfortable and nervous, he told Toth he was actually glad the detective was there. He said he really wanted to give his side of the story. Derek explained that when he started working at J&J, he was given way more work than he had ever expected. And when he couldn't keep up with the workload, he was fired. And then, to make matters worse, John had shorted him $400 on his final paycheck. So, he had gone back to J&J to get the money he felt he was owed. He admitted that it did lead to a physical confrontation, but he insisted they had only pushed each other a bit and that the whole thing had been resolved. He made it sound like it wasn't that big of a deal. But beyond that, Derek insisted that he could not have killed John because he had an alibi. He had spent the entire evening of the murder at a friend's house playing video games. He gave Toth his friend's phone number and said, "Go ahead, call him. He'll confirm everything." Toth tried not to look too disappointed as he wrote down the number. But if this alibi checked out, he would have to rule Derek out as a suspect. Now, it was still possible that Derek had hired someone to kill John, but to Toth, that seemed unlikely. If Derek was that upset over $400, it didn't seem probable that he would have the kind of extra cash needed to pay a hitman. But as Toth left Derek's house and got back into his car, he decided the interview wasn't a total waste of time after all. Because talking to Derek made him realize something. He needed to focus more on John's business life. According to John's brother David, John had gotten rich very young and had built his company very quickly. And in Toth's experience, people who achieve that kind of rapid success often step on a few toes to get to the top. The next day, Toth walked down a hallway at the precinct, heading towards an interrogation room. He had already confirmed Derek's alibi with his friend, so he had to move on to other suspects. And that was fine with Toth because he was about to sit down with his new prime suspect, who happened to be one of his original witnesses. It was John's office manager, Barry Jones. The day before, Toth had gone back to the J&J Parker Industries office. He made it a point to speak to every single employee about John. And what he found out was that, by all accounts, John was a great boss. He pushed his employees to be their best, but he worked just as hard, if not harder, himself. The employees also said that Judy was an essential part of the company and that the Parkers, as a team, were very well respected in the world of vacuum sales. But there was also some office gossip. And this gossip said that their marriage was not as happy as it seemed. It was apparently common knowledge around the office that Judy was having an affair with Barry Jones. A few employees had even claimed they had caught them having sex at the office. Now, neither Barry nor Judy had mentioned any of this the first time Toth had spoken to them. So now, Toth had no idea if anything they had told him was true. Barry could have been lying about being in the bathroom. He could have been the shooter. Or maybe he and Judy were working together and they were both lying to cover their tracks. Toth was leaning towards the second option, because he had also found out that Judy was set to get a very big payday from the death of her husband. She was the beneficiary of a $1 million life insurance policy. And on top of that, John's general estate was worth around $2 million. Maybe Toth thought she and Barry wanted to take John's money and run off together. So when Toth walked into the interrogation room, his plan was to basically tell Barry that the investigation was over, that they had caught him in a lie, and they knew what he did. But when Toth sat down and confronted him, Barry did not act like a guilty man who had been cornered. He was charismatic and confident. He said the affair was just baseless office gossip. He claimed he was just good friends with Judy and that they worked together closely. Barry insisted that he, Judy, and John were like a family. In fact, he said he was currently living with one of Judy's cousins who was visiting from Texas. Now, Toth didn't really believe a word Barry was saying. But even though he kept pressing him, Barry stuck to his story. And eventually, Toth had to let him go. Without any physical evidence, it was just Barry and Judy's word against the word of the employees. And even if they were having an affair, that wasn't enough to prove they had conspired to murder John. On Monday, April 21st, 4 days after John's murder, Toth was at his desk. He was rereading the notes from Barry and Judy's interviews for what felt like the millionth time. He was still trying to find a concrete way to link Judy and Barry to John's murder before he approached Judy about it again. But so far, other than the office rumors, he hadn't found anything. And he didn't really have any other leads. He had learned that the shell casings found at the scene were from a .25 caliber gun. That was useful information to have, but it wasn't going to help him narrow down his suspect list. Toth leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He'd been working on this case non-stop since Thursday night, and he was completely exhausted. He was starting to think about maybe going home and getting some rest when he heard a light knock on his office door. An officer poked his head in and told Toth there was someone on line 3 with a tip, and it sounded like a good one. Toth picked up his phone. The person on the other end of the line explained that they were a police officer as well from a nearby town. They said they had heard about John Parker's murder on the news and realized they had some information that might be relevant. It turned out that about 6 months earlier, this officer had been called to a local juvenile detention facility to take a report. The staff there had done a random search of the kids' belongings and found that 2 of them had a lot of cash, over $200. Having cash was against the rules, and when the kids were asked where they got it, they said it was a payment for a hit on John Parker. That stunned Toth. But it wasn't nearly as shocking as what the officer said next. These 2 kids claimed that the person who had arranged this hit was a former high school classmate of theirs named Daniel Hicks. Toth couldn't believe what he was hearing. Daniel Hicks was John's own 5-year-old stepson. Toth had started to think that this murder could be a professional hit, but it had never even occurred to him that the hit could be linked to John's own family, let alone a child. The officer on the phone explained that they hadn't taken the kid's claim very seriously at the time, so no one had ever notified John's family or spoken to Daniel about it. Toth didn't have to say it, but this was a massive screw-up on their part. But he wasn't focused on placing blame. He was focused on figuring out what had happened. So, Toth got the names of the 2 kids with the cash from the officer. As soon as he hung up, he immediately sent some of his own officers to track those kids down. Then, Toth put in a call to Judy. He needed to bring her son Daniel in for an interview. And since he was a minor, Judy was going to have to come with him. Late that same night, actually after midnight, Toth was once again inside an interrogation room with Judy. But this time, instead of answering questions herself, Judy was sitting in a chair at the back of the room watching. Her son, Daniel, was sitting at the table with Toth and a few other detectives. Toth had spoken to Judy briefly right before this, and she had seemed genuinely shocked to hear that her son had apparently asked someone to kill John. She told Toth there had to be some kind of mistake, and she was happy for the police to speak to Daniel directly because she was sure that would clear this whole mess up. Toth had made a strategic decision not to ask Judy about the affair with Barry at that moment. She was being very cooperative by letting them speak to her son, and he didn't want to upset her and risk her changing her mind. They also hadn't been able to locate the two kids that Daniel had supposedly hired yet, so right now, Daniel was the only one he could question. And now, watching Daniel, Toth could see he was acting like a typical young person who was in trouble. He looked nervous. He was blinking a lot, and he kept wringing his hands like he wasn't really sure what to do with them. So, Toth decided his best approach was just to be direct. Maybe he could scare the truth out of Daniel. So, right off the bat, he told Daniel that he knew about the murder-for-hire plot, and he told him to explain himself. And to Toth's surprise, Daniel took a deep breath and then said it was true. He admitted that he had paid two of his friends some money he had saved up from his allowance because he hated his stepdad. He said John was always on his case, always yelling at him, and Daniel just wanted it to stop. But Daniel insisted that he didn't want John to die. He was adamant that he had just asked his friends to teach John a lesson, to beat him up. Toth thought about this. It was possible that Daniel was telling the truth, and that the two kids in the detention center had either lied about the murder part or had decided on their own to kill John. But that felt a little far-fetched. Why would these kids lie and get themselves into even more trouble? Toth thought it was much more likely that Daniel was the one who was lying. And Toth was not about to let Daniel go anywhere until he found out for sure. So, he told Daniel and Judy that he was sorry, but they were going to have to take Daniel into custody. Then, Toth called some officers into the room to make the arrest. As he left, he could hear Judy and Daniel sounding completely shocked and protesting behind him. At this point, even though Toth had been up all night and was completely exhausted, he actually felt more alert than he had in days. It finally felt like they were making real progress on this case. So, instead of going home to get some rest, he went back to his office, poured himself a cup of coffee, and kept on working. On the 15th of May, 2003, almost a month after John Parker's murder, Detective Don Toth sat at his desk. He was reading over the copy for a flyer and making some last-minute changes to it. So far, it said that the police were looking for information about John Parker's murder, and it offered a reward to anyone who came forward with a tip. Toth planned to pass these flyers out all over town the next day, hoping the public could give him a new lead. It was kind of a desperate move, because while this case had seemed so close to being solved just a few weeks ago, now it was pretty much dead in the water. It had taken the police a while, but they had finally located both of the kids from the detention center, the ones Daniel had supposedly hired. And the kids admitted to meeting with Daniel and taking his money. But it turned out there was just no way they were the actual murderers. One of them had been thousands of miles away in Las Vegas on the night John was killed, and the other had been locked up in a juvenile detention facility. So, since Toth couldn't prove that the assassins Daniel hired had actually killed anyone, he'd had to let Daniel go. But that didn't mean Daniel was innocent. Those two kids had insisted that Daniel did ask for John to be killed, not just beat up. So Daniel was lying about that part. And Toth didn't think that someone who wanted to kill his father had just suddenly changed his mind. But since Toth knew that Daniel was at home babysitting his younger siblings at the exact time of John's murder, Toth figured he'd likely just gotten somebody else to do it for him. But Toth couldn't just keep questioning Daniel. Judy had hired a lawyer, and they were now refusing to let Toth question any of the family members at all. And that was incredibly frustrating because Toth wasn't done with Judy either. Out of everyone involved, she benefited the most from John's death. She was the beneficiary on his life insurance, and she was very likely having an affair with his office manager, Barry. So maybe part of her motive was just to hide the affair from him. And then there was Barry. He was potentially having this affair with John's wife. He might have had his own motive to get rid of John to keep the affair a secret. He also definitely seemed to think that John was a pretty tough boss, so maybe he'd just had enough and was either complicit or actively involved in the murder. He was also at the scene of the crime right when it happened, and since there weren't any cameras, Toth couldn't actually confirm Barry's story about being in the bathroom. But at this point, Toth didn't have the evidence he needed to prove any of these suspects actually killed John or hired someone to do it. And he also didn't have enough evidence to eliminate them and narrow down his pool of suspects. Instead, Toth had just kept adding to it. Because, as of this week, he was also considering John's own brother, David, as a person of interest. A few days ago, some officers had been called to Judy's house because David had stopped by and gotten into a huge verbal fight with the family. And this wasn't the first time it had happened. Apparently, David had gone over there and threatened the family before. One time, he had even damaged their car. This kind of behavior could just mean that David was lashing out because he was grieving the loss of his brother. But it could also mean that he was erratic and potentially violent. Plus, he had been with John on the afternoon of the murder at that buffet. He knew that John was going to have dinner with his wife later, so he could have easily guessed that John, being the workaholic he was, would check in at the office after they were done eating. Toth sighed and took a break from looking at the flyer. His brain was fried. But he felt hopeful. He thought these flyers would give him the tip he desperately needed to finally break this case. And so, the next day, Toth and some other officers passed out the flyers all over town. But then, weeks went by with no tips. And even though Toth did eventually get a few responses to the flyers, none of them gave him any actual, usable evidence. So over the next few months, Toth spent his days in his office, poring over the case files again and again, looking for something he might have missed, maybe a witness they didn't interview, or a piece of evidence they had overlooked. But there was just nothing. And as the months turned into years, Toth had to turn his attention to other projects. And eventually, the John Parker murder case went cold. 4 years after John's murder, on an afternoon in February of 2007, Toth arrived at work for the day and headed to his office. He had never forgotten about the John Parker case, but he was no longer actively investigating it. In fact, all of his cases had been winding down because he was planning to retire in just a few months. But right before he actually got to his office door, a narcotics officer caught up to him in the hallway and asked for a word. The officer explained that he knew Toth wasn't on their narcotics team, but they had a warrant out for a man involved in one of their drug investigations. And they had realized that this man had some crossover with one of Toth's old homicide cases from 2003, the John Parker case. Toth stopped dead in his tracks. He immediately told the officer to go get that man into an interview room. And sure enough, later that day, Toth sat down with this man. He was very chatty and seemed extremely eager to talk. And the first thing this man did was explain that the person he lived with knew John Parker. And this person had admitted to him that they were directly involved in John's death. And when this man told Toth the name of this person, Toth couldn't believe it. He leaned back in his chair, feeling both a wave of relief and a deep sense of disturbance. He was relieved because he finally knew who John Parker's killer was. And he was disturbed because this case was now way more twisted than he had ever imagined. Based on the police investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to John Parker on the night of the 17th of April, 2003. At around 10 p.m., the killer crept slowly through the shadowy parking lot at J&J Parker Industries. They were wearing a mask and dark clothes, and they were carrying a .25 caliber gun. They could see John's car by the office entrance with Judy sitting inside of it, but she was not the killer's target. John was also near the car. He wasn't inside it. He was standing right outside one of the back car doors. The door was open, and he was rifling around inside the car, looking for something. As the killer stared at John, thinking about what they were about to do, they thought about who this man was, how controlling and selfish he was. He had made the killer's life a living hell, and now the killer was going to get their revenge. So, while John's back was still turned, the killer silently walked right up behind him. They raised the gun, aimed it at the back of his head, and they fired. It was a direct hit, right behind the ear. John fell so fast that when the killer fired a second time, the bullet just missed. Now, the killer had never murdered anyone before, so they were shocked by what they had just done. But they were jostled back to reality when they heard John's wife Judy yelling and screaming from inside the car. So, as quickly as they could, the killer grabbed John's wallet to make the police think this was a robbery gone wrong, and then they turned and sprinted off into the night. Much later that night, the killer waited at home until the person who had masterminded this whole thing arrived. This person gave the killer a hug and told them they had done a good job. The mastermind then took the gun, John's wallet, and the clothes the killer had worn during the murder and told the killer they were going to dispose of all of it. And the killer just listened, feeling a sense of relief. They trusted this mastermind more than anyone else in the entire world. Because after all, she was his mother. It would turn out that Judy had convinced her own 5-year-old son, Daniel, to murder his stepfather, her husband. Judy wanted to get out of her marriage with John, but she knew if she divorced him, she would have only gotten half of his estate and their business. With his death, she could get the whole thing. It turned out she had already tried to kill John before, just unsuccessfully. First, she had tried to poison him. When that didn't work, she had tried to hire a hitman herself. But that also failed. So, finally, she asked Daniel to help, promising him that he would get some of the money. She had also enlisted her daughter, Christina, who was the one who found the gun that was used to kill John. Daniel had actually tried to hire someone else for the job first, but then ultimately decided to do it himself. He used his younger siblings as an alibi, saying he was at home babysitting them all night. And the man who told all of this to the police was Christina's husband, who she had married 2 years after John's death. Once her husband gave the authorities the entire story, the police interrogated both Christina and Daniel, who eventually confessed to everything. Judy was convicted of murder and sentenced to 33 years in prison. Daniel got 23 years in prison for pulling the trigger. And Christina received 5 years for her part in the murder as well. In a tragic end to an already devastating story, Christina would die in 2013 from a drug overdose. Daniel was released from prison in 2017, and his mother Judy was released in 2022. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya! There is a vast, uncharted region of territory known as the Northwest Territories that may be found at the farthest northernmost part of Canada. This is an area of unadulterated, breathtaking beauty. The globe is filled with vast forests, rugged mountains, and rivers that are both powerful and winding. In order to provide you with an idea of the magnitude of this single land, it is 4 times larger than the entirety of the country of Germany. Nevertheless, the Northwest Territories have a population of approximately 50,000 people, in contrast to Germany, which is home to more than 80 million people. This location is among the most inaccessible, rugged, and sparsely populated areas on the entire planet. A land that is truly wild. In addition, a valley may be found smack dab in the middle of this enormous wilderness. A region of terrain that is 10,000 square miles in size and is so remote and difficult to access that it is thought that there are still parts of it that no human being has ever set foot in. The Nahanni Valley is the name given to this location. Over the course of several centuries, the Nahanni Valley has been a site of lore, a location that has been discussed in hushed tones between campfires among people. The indigenous peoples of the area have said for a long time that it is a place that should be avoided. Dark ghosts and odd happenings can be found in this location. The Naha were notable for being one of the first known tribes to attempt to establish a home there. The valley was their home for a period of time, but eventually, for reasons that are not clear, they disappeared. Suddenly, they vanished, leaving behind a vibrant community that had been there for a day with them. As if they had just vanished into the thin, chilly air, all of their possessions, including their pottery, their tools, and their dwellings, were left behind. It was only in their writings that they left any traces behind. In their writing, they described odd animals that were pallid and hunted the forests at night. White devils, or Swahila, was the name they gave to them. From the beginning of their writings, they were overwhelmed with an ever-increasing sense of fear regarding these aliens, and suddenly, they simply stopped writing. The Naha had passed away. The other tribes that inhabited in the area did not completely disappear, but they did run away. As they packed up their belongings and left the valley, they vowed that they would never return, therefore establishing the Nahani as a location that was both cursed and forbidden. These were merely thought to be old tales, folklore that was intended to keep people away for a considerable amount of time. At the beginning of the 20th century, however, a sequence of actual events began to take place in the Nahani Valley. The occurrences were so peculiar and terrible that they gave the impression that the old legends might not be legends at all. The true beginning of our story takes place in 1904, with three brothers. Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod were the four individuals in question. Gold prospectors who lived and worked in the Northwest Territories were the toughest and most experienced individuals in the industry. It was common knowledge that they were familiar with the tales that were told about the Nahani Valley. They were well aware that it was regarded as a foreboding and even haunted location. In contrast, a gold prospector may view a location that everyone else is too terrified to explore as an opportunity to pursue their interests. Assuming that no one had entered the room, they reasoned that the gold must have been taken by no one. The Nahani Valley is a place that is so beautiful and unspoiled that it is impossible for there not to be gold there. Consequently, the three McLeod brothers made the decision that they were going to be the ones to face the valley, despite the cautions and the horrible legends that were spoken about it. They said their goodbyes to their family, gathered their belongings, and then embarked on their journey through the wilderness. The process of entering the valley was a challenge in and of itself. At that time, there were no highways or actual trails. The decision to travel by boat meant that they would have to endure a difficult trek upriver. They had to cross perilous waters, and at numerous points, they were required to physically disassemble their boat, take the pieces of lumber and their gear up and past large waterfalls, and then reconstruct the boat on the opposite side of the river. Although it was a difficult and grueling process that would have deterred the majority of people, the McLeods were unwavering in their commitment. In due time, the effort that they put in paid off. Ironically, the Flat River is a violent and turbulent river that slices through the middle of the valley. They arrived to the primary waterway that provides access to the valley. In order to find a little section of beachfront where they could beach their boat and set up a camp, they maneuvered through its rapids until they discovered it. They found themselves encircled by enormous mountains and deep trees that were completely silent. Despite the fact that it was a frightening environment, they were there for a specific cause. As they entered the icy river, they retrieved their equipment, including their sluices, and continued their journey. They located it almost shortly after search. Golden. And it's not just a few bits of snow. It was difficult to believe. One might get the impression that the entire riverbed was glistening with it. Over the course of several days, from dawn to dusk, they labored tirelessly to extract an extraordinary quantity of gold from water. This was the score of a lifetime, beyond everything they could have ever imagined achieving. Finally, they had amassed such a large quantity of gold that they were unable to physically transport any more of it. Their boat was completely full, and they were aware that it was time to depart, sell their discoveries, and then make preparations for a subsequent journey. As they began their journey back down the Flat River, they arrived at their destination in a positive frame of mind. They had a lot of money. They were successful in their gamble. It was clear that the valley would not allow them to go without a fight. During the course of their journey across a particularly turbulent stretch of the river, their overloaded boat became entangled in the stream, causing it to capsize. Anything and everything was hurled into the water that was churning in an instant. Despite being drenched in water and shivering, the brothers were able to safely make their way to the shore. As they retrieved their rifles and the few supplies they were able to recover, they discovered that the gold had been completely depleted. It was gone for all time, having sunk to the bottom of the swiftly running river due to its depth. Even though they were in utter disarray, they managed to pull through. they were aware that there was further gold on the other side of that. So they went back to the spot where they had initially set up their tent. They made preparations to begin their journey anew in the morning and put up their tent. They arose early the following morning and once again made their way to the river, returning to the very same location where they had discovered a fortune just a few days before. On the other hand, there was nothing this time. In spite of spending the entire day excavating, sluicing, and hunting for flake, they were unable to locate even a single one. As if the gold had disappeared, the Naha tribe had also disappeared at the same time. They remained for a few more days, but they were aware that they needed to go because their supplies were running low and their boat was no longer available. They were able to live, and they were aware that the valley contained a hidden riches that was sufficient for the time being. They began the long and painful journey out of the valley on foot, packing up what little they had left and packing up their belongings. Willie and Frank, the two younger brothers, were more determined than they had ever been before when they finally made it back to civilization. They had already begun contemplating their subsequent journey. In spite of the fact that they had saw the gold with their own eyes, they were not going to allow a single obstacle to deter them. However, Charlie, the family's oldest brother, had a different opinion. The encounter had left him feeling unsettled. When they were out there by themselves in that huge desert, he couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to passing away. He conveyed to his brothers that he would not be returning. Even though he was certain that they would most likely discover further gold, he wished them luck. However, his time in the Nahanni Valley had come to an end. Willie and Frank were dissatisfied, but they were sympathetic to the situation. They discovered a guy named Robert Weir, who was willing to join them in their endeavor. The new Weir family, consisting of Willie, Frank, and Robert Weir, embarked on their journey 1 year later, at the beginning of 1905, with the intention of returning to the Nahanni Valley. Everyone in their community was aware of their intended destination and the things they were looking forward to discovering. They did not have a predetermined date for their return. A journey of this nature could have lasted for several months or even a whole year back in those days. You simply went, and by the time you returned, you had already returned. After a few weeks, months passed. It was a shift of seasons. For the entirety of the year, Willie, Frank, and Robert did not communicate with one another in any way. People in the village began to feel anxious, but Charlie, the brother who had remained behind, calmed everyone, removing their concerns. He informed them that his brothers had a lot of experience. They had a sense of what they were doing. He described the valley as challenging but not insurmountable. He reassured everyone that they should not be concerned. On the other hand, another year went by. Now, the year was 1907. Over the course of 2 full years, his brothers had made their way into that valley. Even Charlie was unable to dispute the fact that something was awry at this point. The amount of time that had passed without any communication was simply too lengthy. He was aware that he needed to go and look for them. He assembled a search group consisting of 4 other men, and together they embarked on a journey into the Nahanni Valley. They followed the same perilous path that he had traveled with his brothers many years earlier. After leading his men up the flat river, Charlie headed in the direction of the same shoreline where they had slept earlier. Upon arrival at the location, they discovered that his siblings and their camp had vanished without a trace. They proceeded on their way, making further inroads into the valley. At that point, the river made a dramatic turn that was almost 90 degrees, and this location is known as the Big Bend. As a result of this turn, they entered a portion of the valley that is commonly referred to as Second Canyon. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. On either side of them, the walls of the canyon climbed higher, giving the impression of steep cliffs that rose thousands of feet into the sky. Because of the steepness of the walls and the proximity of the walls to the water, there was no space for a boat to land. Once you entered Second Canyon, you were obligated to travel 10 miles in this claustrophobic passageway that was completely dark. The wind howled down the canyon, producing a peculiar sound that was similar to whistling and nearly sounded like a moan. They were able to see the dark holes of hundreds of caverns from a prominent vantage point on the cliff walls, which appeared to be empty eyes watching them pass by. The location felt spooky and frightening to be in. Later on, the guys would assert that they had the unsettling and persistent sensation that they were being observed at all times. As they made their way through the canyon, which was 10 miles long, they searched the water and the cliffs for any indication that the guys had gone missing inside. They were eventually able to emerge from the stifling shadow of Second Canyon, and as they did so, the valley suddenly became more open. This location, once again, included a few isolated stretches of shoreline, and they got a glimpse of it on one of those quaint beaches farther up ahead. It is a tent. Their hearts leapt for joy. While they were calling out the names of Willie and Frank, they navigated their boat in the direction of the beach. They quickly made their way to the campsite when they beached the boat. They noticed a figure sleeping on the ground close to some trees as they came closer to the position. It was a man who was unconscious and lying on his back, with his arm extended in a manner that suggested he was attempting to grab the weapon that was leaning against a nearby tree. After that, they discovered another body, this one lying face down and partially within the tent and partially outside of it. They were getting closer as the horrific reality of the situation grew more and more apparent. The heads of both of the males were out of place. Charlie was able to determine the identities of the deceased by using personal belongings that were discovered at the camp. Willie and Frank were his brothers. They were his brothers. Robert Weir seemed to be nowhere to be found. A search group went around the camp looking for anything. The etching was discovered by them cut into the tree at the location where the weapon was leaning. It stated, "We have found a fine prospect." This gave the impression that they had discovered gold. Nevertheless, a comprehensive investigation of the camp and the riverbank in the vicinity led to the discovery of nothing. There was not a single ounce of gold ever discovered. The event was really unsettling to witness. One of the brothers was obviously reaching for his firearm at the time of his death. It seemed as though the other individual had been attempting to escape from the tent. Moreover, their heads were completely absent. After collecting as much information as they could, Charlie and his men left the valley, bearing the weighty news of what they had discovered before them. They informed the mounted police about all that had happened. The authorities began their own inquiry into the matter. However, despite the fact that they discovered another skeleton a little distance downstream, which was also missing its head, they refused to identify it as belonging to Robert Weir. The official conclusion that they came to was that Willie and Frank had simply passed out due to malnutrition and that animals had taken their heads off of them. Charlie was angry with rage. He was well aware that this was not logical. What was written on the tree, where the bodies were located, and what was missing from the heads. As a whole, it indicated that there was something violent and something sinister. The case, however, was resolved. On the other hand, the news quickly traveled throughout the Northwest Territories like wildfire to everyone. A horrifying new chapter had been added to the story of the valley that was said to be cursed. Additionally, beginning on that day, the region of the Nahanni Valley that encompassed Second Canyon all the way to the location where the McLeod brothers were discovered was renamed accordingly. Eventually, people began to refer to it as the Headless Valley. A small number of people had the courage to trek inside the Nahanni during the subsequent few years. In addition to being too recent, the narrative of the McLeod brothers was also too terrifying. In order to entice people to enter a location where men lost their heads, the promise of wealth was not sufficient attraction. But recollections are short-lived, and greed is a potent driver of behavior. 5 years after the brothers were discovered, in 1913, a prospector by the name of Martin Jorgensen made the decision that he was courageous enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to try his luck at finding the brothers. As a solitary individual, he was a hardy outdoorsman who was confident in his ability to deal with anything the valley had in store for him. At a distance of approximately 70 miles from the Headless Valley, he ventured into the Nahanni region by himself, and, rather than establishing a temporary camp, he constructed a modest and durable hut for himself. Because he was confident that he would make his fortune there, he intended to remain for an entire year. And it appeared that he was correct for a period of time. Due to the fact that he was able to communicate the news to his business associates, we are aware that he discovered gold. A straightforward and victorious message was sent. It seemed as though he had hit it rich. Once a year had passed, he instructed them to meet him at a location that had been prearranged outside of the valley. After a year had passed, his companions made their way to the scheduled meeting location. Even though they waited, Martin Jorgensen did not appear at any point. Due to the fact that this was absolutely out of character, his partners made the decision to descend into the valley in order to locate him. They were armed with the directions that he had sent. As they continued to follow his track, they were eventually able to locate the site of his cabin. However, the cabin was no longer there. What was left behind was nothing more than a heap of burnt wood and ash. It had been entirely consumed by fire and gone up in flames. In addition, the decapitated body of Martin Jorgensen was discovered lying on the ground close to the decaying remains of the cabin. To reiterate, there was no gold to be discovered anywhere in the area. It was decided to call in the mounted police once more. Yet another investigation was carried out by them. Again, they came up with an explanation that was completely in line with the natural world. They came to the conclusion that Jorgensen must have used his stove in a way that caused an accident, which was the cause of the fire. Predation by animals was the cause of the missing head, as was the case with the lost head. It was yet another case that had been resolved, yet another horrible event that occurred in the harsh woods. However, the trend was becoming increasingly difficult for many people to ignore. 8 years later, in 1921, John O'Brien and an anonymous partner, 2 other prospectors, made the decision to test their luck and see what would happen. Despite the fact that they were aware of the tales, they were of the belief that there was a return for every risk. The Headless Valley itself was not too far away from where they established their tent. And very immediately, they discovered gold, just like the others had done. They disseminated the news that they had achieved their goals and that they intended to remain for a considerable amount of time. It had been a couple of weeks since they had begun their journey, and they were getting low on food. Along the path that they used to enter the valley, they had placed a number of animal traps in various locations. For the purpose of examining the traps, John O'Brien informed his partner that he was going to make the journey. It was a lengthy trek that would take him 8 or 9 days to complete, and it was a circuit. For the sake of protecting their wealth and supplies, his partner remained in the camp with them. In spite of the passage of 9 days, John O'Brien did not come back. His companions started to feel concerned about him. It was by accident that he came upon another solitary prospector who was in the vicinity, and the 2 men decided to undertake the mission of searching for O'Brien together. They continued to call his name as they followed the line of traps. They walked for a considerable amount of time. At the moment when the sun was beginning to drop, they entered a tiny clearing. One of the fallen logs was located in the middle of the clearing. In addition, there was a man who was seated on the log with his back to them. "John, is that you?" they yelled out, but there was no response to their question. Completely still, the figure remained in that position. They moved closer with increased caution. They made their way around the log, and as they did so, they saw that it was, in fact, John O'Brien. He was sitting in an upright position, his demeanor uninterested, and he was simply staring into the ashes of a small bonfire that had been extinguished at his feet. He had a book of matches in his hand, and he was holding it tightly. In addition, he had been fully and utterly frozen to death. It was a peculiar fact that the temperature had not been very low. The police, who later inspected the site, said in their report that it appeared as though he had been slain so suddenly that he had no time to react, no time to even realize what was happening. They said that it was as if he had been flash frozen. In the midst of the forest, he remained still, like a statue completely frozen in place. At this point, the stories were stacking up. Burned cabins, headless bodies, and a guy frozen solid make up the scene. The authorities continued to explain that each of these instances was distinct and unrelated to one another, and that they were simply the brutal facts of living in the wild. However, the general public was not entirely convinced. There was a widespread consensus that the Nahanni Valley was a haunted and cursed location at this point. Then, in the year 1926, an event that was both one of the most peculiar and chilling of all time occurred. In the valley, a wealthy hunting party made their entrance. There were perhaps 12 of them, and they were being guided by an experienced guide. It was their belief that there was protection in numbers. They established their camp in close proximity to the river, not too far from the Headless Valley. Nothing of note happened on the first day. After going on a hunt, they went back to their camp and spent the evening around a large bonfire, enjoying each other's company while exchanging stories. They awoke the following morning to discover that one of their party members had vanished without a trace. Annie Lafferty, a young woman, became absent from the scene. She had not yet removed her possessions from her tent. There was no note, and there was no indication that there had been a struggle. In the middle of the night, she had simply disappeared without a trace. The group spent the entire day looking for her, searching the woods and shouting her name numerous times, but they were unable to locate any trace of her. Eventually, they were forced to leave the valley and declare her missing to the authorities. An extensive and official search procedure was initiated. Because her family was so powerful and wealthy, they spared no cost in their spending. But after a number of weeks of hunting, they came up empty-handed. The valley itself seemed to have engulfed Annie Lafferty, as if she had been consumed by it. A man named Charlie, who was known for his solitude and his love of the outdoors, was found in a pub in one of the smaller villages located in the Northwest Territories a few months later. Some men were discussing the mysterious disappearance of Annie Lafferty, and he overheard them talking about it. A look of horror appeared on his face as he listened to the specifics of the incident, including the date and the location. It dawned on him that he had been present. Something had been observed by him. His astonishing narrative was promptly relayed to the authorities, and he went to the police station. During the period when the hunting team was stationed in the Nahanni Valley, he explained that he had been camping by himself in the valley. Even in the evening, he was close enough to them that he could hear their voices. He was not too far away. It was the night that Annie vanished, and he claimed that he was unable to sleep. It was while he was sitting outside his tent that he became aware of a peculiar sound. The sound that could be heard was that of little rocks being dropped into the river, one after the other. The sound was not a natural one, like the sound of rock slides. It appeared to be intentional. He stood up and made his way towards the riverbank in a stealthy manner in order to gain a better glimpse. It was a full moon, and it was shining brightly, which illuminated the area. He turned his gaze downstream, in the direction of the position of the hunting party's camp. He then became aware of it. A woman was climbing up a high, rocky ridge that ran alongside the river while she was absolutely naked. She was on all fours. Unlike a coyote, she was traveling at an unnaturally fast speed, similar to that of an animal. Both her hands and her feet were responsible for the dislodging of small stones, which then fell down the bank and splashed into the river with each step that she took. His ears had been picking up on that particular sound. He stood there, still, observing her in silence. It seemed to him that she was completely insane, and that she would perish from exposure out there. Nevertheless, she came to a halt just as she reached the highest point of the ridge. It appeared as though she was looking right at him when she moved her head. In addition, Charlie reported to the authorities that her face had been contorted into a frightening and inhumane grimace. As he described it, her eyes appeared to be utterly possessed. Because he was so afraid, he stumbled backward and hurried back to his tent, where he might find refuge from the danger. Over the crest of the ridge, the woman disappeared without a trace. Charlie was shown an image of Annie Lafferty, the woman who had gone missing, despite the fact that the police were still doubtful. Without any sign of doubt, he acknowledged it. He had seen the woman rushing naked on all fours into the dark core of the Nahanni Valley. That was the woman he had seen. There was no further sighting of Annie. The number of victims proceeded to reach new heights. In 1931, a prospector by the name of Phil Powers constructed a cabin, discovered gold, and then vanished without a trace. His charred cabin was discovered by a search party that had been sent out. Although the body of Powers was found inside, the investigation discovered that the fire had begun on the roof, which indicates that he would have had a sufficient amount of time to flee the building. As a result, it was determined that it was highly probable that he had already passed away inside his cabin before the fire even began. The year 1936 saw the disappearance of two other prospectors, namely William Epper and Joseph Mulholland. In addition, their cottage was discovered to be completely destroyed by fire. However, this time there were no remains found at all. Simply put, they had disappeared. At the campsite where he was staying in 1945, the body of a guy named Ernest Sabard was discovered inside his sleeping bag. Additionally, he was a prospector who had vanished without a trace. The search crew discovered him without his head when they found him. The year 1946 saw the occurrence of the last important incident. An additional large search party was dispatched to the area in an effort to locate a missing prospector by the name of John Patterson. The individual who was in charge of this search party was a man who was resolute, unyielding, and unwavering in his commitment to unraveling the enigma. They established their fortifications in the Headless Valley, which was the same region in which the McLeod brothers had been discovered. They were sitting around their fire one evening when, all of a sudden, a man emerged from the shade of the forest. The native man wore traditional garb and was dressed in traditional garb. Immediately, he approached the person who was in charge of the search party. His name was not disclosed by him. This is a terrifying warning that he just issued. After that, he informed them that they had to depart the valley without delay. According to him, there were white creatures that were walking around in the woods all around them, and they were very close to their camp. Before the leader of the search group could ask any questions, the man turned around, walked back into the forest, and vanished without a trace. All of the members of the search team were terrified that night by the horrific sounds that emanated from the forest that were all around them. In addition to the sound of enormous trees smashing to the ground, they heard screams and wails that went through their bodies. It was reported by a few of the men that they had witnessed tall white figures moving between the trees that were located on the edge of the firelight. As soon as the sun rose the following morning, they decided to give up their hunt for John Patterson and get away from the valley completely. In a later statement, the leader of the party, the individual who had entered the valley with such a high level of self-assurance, stated that he had never been more terrified in his entire life and that he would never again set foot in that valley. We were never able to locate John Patterson. After that, it appeared as though the odd occurrences in the Nahanni Valley had stopped. However, this is primarily due to the fact that people stopped going in. There were now too many of them, they were too consistent, and they were too terrifying to remain ignored. Thereafter, in the year 1976, the Government of Canada took an unusual action. National park status was bestowed upon the Nahanni Valley by the government. On the surface, it appeared as though this was a move to preserve the natural beauty of the area. In contrast, if you examine the park's regulations in greater detail, you will notice something peculiar. The area does not have any tourist facilities, visitor centers, or trails that are clearly marked. And perhaps most importantly, there are significant portions of the park that have been designated as being completely off-limits to visitors. Nobody is permitted to enter these areas at any time. Neither visitors nor researchers, and not even employees of the park. In addition, the Headless Valley serves as the focal point of the largest of these restricted areas. There is still a legal prohibition against entering the very locations where all of these strange and horrifying events took place, and this prohibition continues to this day. There are a lot of people who think that the government did not establish the park in order to protect the valley from people. They are under the impression that it was designed to shield people from whatever is located in the valley. Annie Lafferty continued to be a mystery, and the mystery of what happened to all of those prospectors has not been solved. The Nahanni Valley is a place where no one is permitted to look, and it is there that the valley conceals its information. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? Some stories you hear seem to sit right on the edge of what we understand. They feel like they could be true, they have all the pieces of a real event, But there's always one detail, one piece of the puzzle that just doesn't fit into our world. Tonight, we're going to look at 3 such stories. They are separated by time and distance, but they all share that one chilling detail that pushes them from the ordinary into something else entirely. We begin on a quiet farm in rural Ohio in the summer of 1921. A young man named Carl Logis stood on the porch of his new farmhouse, looking out at the land he now owned. It was a warm evening, and the crickets were chirping their endless song. He took a deep breath of the country air. This was it. This was everything he had ever worked for. Carl was not a complicated man. He had a simple dream, one that he'd held on to since he was a boy, to own his own piece of land, to work it with his own 2 hands, and to live a quiet, self-sufficient life. And now, against all odds, he had it. The farm was modest, with a small house, a sturdy barn, and a reliable water well. The fields stretched out into the darkness, promising a future of hard work and honest reward. He'd even managed to buy it for a surprisingly low price. The family who sold it to him had been in a huge hurry to leave. They didn't say much about why, just that they were ready for a change, ready for the city. Carl didn't ask too many questions. A good deal was a good deal, and he saw it as his good fortune. He stepped off the porch, a lantern in one hand, its yellow light cutting a small circle in the deep darkness of the night. He had a pistol holstered on his hip, more out of habit than any real sense of danger. It was time for his final check of the animals before turning in for the night. His horses and cattle were his livelihood, and he took their care seriously. As he walked across the yard, the crunch of his boots on the dry soil was the only sound besides the crickets. He looked back at his little farmhouse, its windows dark, and then ahead towards the large, dark shape of the barn. He felt a swell of pride. This was all his. He was alone out here, master of his own small world. And then, the feeling came. It was sudden and sharp. A prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the kind that makes you feel like you've been caught doing something you shouldn't. He felt with absolute certainty that he was being watched. He stopped dead in his tracks. But that was impossible. He lived completely alone. His nearest neighbor was miles away. There were no roads nearby that people would be walking on this late at night. It was just him, his land, and his animals. Instinctively, he whipped around, raising the lantern high. The light swung wildly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to jump and flee. He scanned the open fields, the line of trees in the distance, the area around the farmhouse. Nothing. Just the empty, dark landscape. He listened intently, holding his breath. He heard nothing but the wind rustling through the tall grass. His practical mind immediately started searching for a rational explanation. A predator, maybe? A coyote or a fox? He looked around again. The night was peaceful. The crickets hadn't stopped their chirping, which they usually did if a large predator was near. And the previous owners hadn't mentioned any problems with dangerous animals in the area. He shook his head, a small, frustrated sigh escaping his lips. He was just being paranoid. That had to be it. He was new to this property, new to living so isolated. Every little sound, every shadow was magnified by the darkness and the silence. He told himself to calm down, that he was just letting his imagination get the better of him. "Go check your animals and go to bed," he muttered to himself. "Everything is fine." He turned and continued his walk to the barn, his pace a little quicker than before. He slid open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The familiar smells of hay and livestock filled the air, and the gentle sounds of the animals shifting in their stalls were comforting. He set about his work, topping off their water, checking their feed, making sure everything was secure for the night. He busied himself for a few minutes, his mind focused on the simple, repetitive tasks. For a little while, he managed to forget about that strange, unsettling feeling he'd had outside. He was finishing up, giving one of his horses a final pat on the neck when the feeling returned. This time, it was even stronger. It was an intense, piercing feeling, as if a pair of eyes were boring right into his back. He stood frozen for a moment, then slowly turned to look out the open barn door. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. He couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. He scanned the dark corners of the barn itself, the hayloft above. Nothing. Still, the feeling persisted. He was not alone. He tried to tell himself again that it was just his nerves, but deep down, a cold knot of fear was tightening in his stomach. The walk back to the farmhouse, which a few minutes ago had been a source of pride, now seemed like a long and treacherous journey through enemy territory. But he couldn't stay in the barn all night. He took a deep breath to steel his resolve. He picked up his lantern, and his other hand instinctively went to the gun on his hip, his fingers resting on the worn leather of the holster. He stepped out of the barn and began walking quickly towards the house, his head on a swivel, scanning the darkness on either side of him. He was about halfway across the yard when a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was on the far side of his property, out in the distance. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised his lantern, aiming the beam in that direction. The light was weak at that distance, but it was enough. He could clearly see a figure. Someone was standing on his land. They were just standing there, perfectly still, a tall, pale silhouette against the dark fields. It looked almost white in the dim light. For a second, Carl was too shocked to move. He just stood there, holding the lantern, staring at this silent intruder. The figure was standing near his water well. Finally, his shock gave way to anger. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the quiet of the night. "Who are you? What are you doing on my property?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even seem to flinch. It just stood there, seemingly staring right back at him. Then, slowly, it turned and began to move. It wasn't walking or running. It was more like it was gliding, moving away from Carl and towards the water well. That's when Carl's fear and anger boiled over. This was a trespasser. This must have been who was watching him earlier. Were they trying to rob him? Scope out his property? He wasn't going to let them get away. He drew his gun from its holster and started running towards the figure, shouting for them to stop. As he ran, the lantern in his other hand swung back and forth, making the light unsteady. The white figure seemed to flicker in and out of view between the bouncing shadows. He was closing the distance, but the figure was moving with an unnatural speed. He lost sight of it for a moment behind a small rise in the ground. By the time he reached the water well, panting and out of breath, the person was gone. They had just vanished. He stood there, scanning the area in every direction. There was nowhere for them to have gone so quickly. The fields were wide open. There were no trees or buildings to hide behind. It was as if they had just dissolved into the night air. Carl didn't know what to think. Was this person playing games with him? Had they circled back around to his house while he was chasing them? The uncertainty was terrifying. All he could think to do was yell out into the darkness. He warned them that he had a gun and he wasn't afraid to use it. He told them to get off his property and never come back. But his threats were met with nothing but silence. The crickets had stopped chirping now. The night was eerily still. For a long time, Carl just stood there by the well, his gun still in his hand, his eyes straining to see any sign of movement in the darkness. But the figure never reappeared. Eventually, the cold night air began to seep into his bones. He knew he couldn't stand out here all night. With one last paranoid look around, he turned and ran the rest of the way to his farmhouse. He burst through the door, slammed it shut, and slid the bolt home. The next morning, with the sun streaming through his windows, the events of the previous night felt like a bad dream. Carl tried to rationalize it. It must have been a local prankster, or maybe a neighbor who was too shy to introduce themselves properly. Or perhaps it was a would-be thief who got scared off when Carl shouted and drew his gun. Whatever it was, he told himself it was a one-time thing. He had stood his ground, and they wouldn't be back. He desperately wanted to believe that. But he was wrong. That night, and almost every single night for the next year, the same thing happened. Around 9:30 p.m., just as Carl would be heading out to the barn for his final check, he would see the figure. It was always there, standing at a distance, a pale shape watching him from the edge of his property. It never got any closer, and he could never make out any features. It was just a silent, ever-present observer. Every night, Carl would scream at it, curse at it, tell it to leave. He would run towards it, his gun in his hand. One night, in a fit of rage and desperation, he even fired a shot in its direction. But every single time, the outcome was the same. The figure would turn, glide silently towards the water well, and then, right around that area, it would simply vanish. As the months wore on, Carl's initial anger and fear slowly turned into a kind of weary resignation. He wanted to believe it was just a persistent trespasser, someone with a strange obsession who was impossibly good at hiding. But he knew deep down that wasn't the case. Though he was not a superstitious man, he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The way it moved, the way it disappeared into thin air, it had to be a ghost. What else could it be? And then he would remember the family who sold him the farm, how eager they were to leave, how they practically gave the place away. He started to think that maybe their hurry to get out had something to do with his nightly visitor. But as terrifying as it was to live with a ghost on his property, Carl clung to one fact. It was predictable. It appeared at the same time, in the same area, and it never did anything more than just watch. It never came near the house, never bothered his animals. It was a frightening, but ultimately harmless, part of his new normal. He learned to live with it. That is, until the 1st of August 1922, almost exactly 1 year to the day after he had bought the farm. On that day, something changed. Carl went out to water his horses and cattle, just as he did every day. But this time, they wouldn't drink. They shied away from the troughs, snorting and stamping their feet nervously. They acted as if the water was poisoned. Carl was baffled. It was the same water from the same well they had been drinking for a year without any issue. He cupped his hands and tasted it himself. It tasted fine to him, clean and fresh. But the animals were adamant. Something was wrong with the water. He realized the only way to solve the problem was to clean out the well. He would have to drain all the existing water, scrub the inside, and let it refill with fresh, clean groundwater. So, Carl went over to the well, the very spot where the ghostly figure disappeared every night. He set up the pump and began the long, laborious process of draining it. As the water level slowly dropped, he peered down into the dark opening. He saw something. There was something large at the bottom of the well, something that had been hidden deep beneath the surface of the water. As the water level got lower and lower, the object became clearer. It wasn't a rock or a piece of old equipment. It was a tangled mess of what looked like old clothes and bones. His blood ran cold. He knew immediately what he had to do. He stopped the pump and ran to get the sheriff. The discovery at the bottom of the well reopened a 5-year-old cold case. It turned out that before Carl, and even before the family who sold him the farm, the property had been owned by a man named Frank Lerman. Frank had employed several farmhands, including a young man named Henry Lipenstick. One day, 5 years earlier, Henry had simply vanished. He had no family or close friends in the area, so most people just assumed he had packed up and left town to find work elsewhere. But one of Frank's neighbors had her doubts. She went to the sheriff at the time and told him that she didn't think Henry had just left. She thought Frank Lerman might have had something to do with his disappearance. She said the two of them argued constantly, usually about money. She could hear them shouting at each other from her own property. She said there was real, palpable tension between them. The sheriff had tried to investigate her claim. He went to speak with Frank, but just as the investigation was getting started, Frank abruptly sold the farm and moved away without a forwarding address. With no body and no real evidence of foul play, the sheriff had no choice but to close the case. Until now. 5 years later, the body found at the bottom of Carl Lugisa's well was identified as Henry Lipenstick. His remains were badly decomposed, mostly skeletal, but identification was confirmed. An autopsy revealed that Henry had died from blunt force trauma to the head. His death was officially ruled a homicide. Frank Lerman was tracked down, arrested, and charged with second-degree murder. He was found guilty, but the conviction didn't stick. After only 7 months, his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence from so long ago, and he was released. But there was one more detail, one final, chilling piece to the story. When they carefully removed Henry's remains from the well to give him a proper burial, they noticed he was still wearing a watch on his skeletal wrist. The watch was broken, its hands frozen in time. It had stopped at 9:35 p.m. This was almost precisely the time, every single night for a year, that Carl Logis had seen that white, ghostly figure running towards the well before disappearing. After Henry Leipenstick's body was finally recovered and laid to rest in a proper grave, Carl Logis never saw the white figure on his farm ever again. The haunting was over. Our next story takes us forward in time a bit to the winter of 1933 and to a grand castle in southern Poland. Inside one of the castle's many lavish sitting rooms, a young nobleman named Anton Holberg was hosting a party for his friends. The room was filled with laughter and the smoke from expensive cigars. Anton, already quite drunk, was attempting to pour another round of drinks. He weaved his way back towards the card table where his friends were playing blackjack, but he stumbled, spilling most of the liquor onto a priceless carpet. Instead of being embarrassed, he just found it hilarious. So did his friends. They all roared with laughter as he clumsily picked up the nearly empty glasses from the floor. As a joke, he continued to the table and handed out the empty cups, and his friends, equally drunk and jovial, played along, pretending to toast with them. The dealer for the next round began to pass out the cards. And it was in that moment that a loud, groaning creak echoed down from the ceiling right above them. The sound was so distinct and so loud that it cut through the noise of the party. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked up. A moment of silence fell over the room. In that sudden quiet, Anton grinned and waved a dismissive hand. "Oh boy," he said with a chuckle. "That's just the monk." Most of his friends at the table knew what he was talking about. They had all heard Anton's favorite story about the castle being haunted by a so-called hooded monk. But there was one new friend in the group that night who hadn't heard the tale. He looked at Anton with a confused expression. "The monk? What are you talking about?" The other friends groaned playfully. They knew what was coming. Anton's eyes lit up. He loved telling this story. He turned to his new friend and launched into his well-rehearsed tale. He explained that when he first took ownership of the castle, he was told by the previous owners that the entire estate was his to enjoy, with one exception. There was a single bedroom on the second floor that was to remain locked and untouched at all times. The reason, they claimed, was that the room was haunted by the malevolent spirit of a hooded monk who patrolled it endlessly. Anton admitted to his friends that he had always heeded the warning. He had never once set foot inside that room. He had dozens of other bedrooms, so he didn't need it, but more than that, a part of him actually believed the story might be true. He liked the idea that his grand castle had a genuine, terrifying secret. He concluded his story by pointing a finger towards the ceiling. "And that bedroom," he said with a dramatic flair, "is right above us. So maybe that creak we just heard really was the monk." Usually, his friends would just humor him and move on. It was just a silly ghost story Anton liked to tell. But tonight, the new friend's reaction changed the dynamic. He stared at Anton in disbelief. "Wait a minute," he said. "You're telling me you own this entire castle, but there's a room in it that you've never been inside just because of some old ghost story? Are you serious?" As he said it out loud, the other friends started to see it from a new perspective. It did sound a bit cowardly when you put it like that. Suddenly, Anton's fun ghost story made him seem weak. They all started to pile on. "Yeah, Anton, what's the deal?" "It's your castle." "You can't be scared of one little room." Anton's cheerful mood quickly soured. He tried to brush it off, telling them to forget it and get back to the card game. But his friends wouldn't let it go. They were drunk and looking for some fun, and now they had a target. The goading turned into a dare. You know what you should do, Anton? You should spend the night in that room. Tonight. Prove to us you're not afraid. At first, Anton refused. But his friends were relentless, and his drunken pride was on the line. He couldn't stand them thinking he was a coward in his own home. Finally, he slammed his hand on the table. Fine, he declared. I'll do it. I'll spend the night in there. I'll show you all it's just a stupid story. He probably assumed that by the time the party ended, everyone would be too drunk and tired to remember the dare. He figured he could just slip away to his own comfortable bedroom and no one would be the wiser. But his friends did not forget. When the card game finally wound down and it was time for everyone to go to bed, they all stood up and looked at Anton. All right, Anton, one of them said with a grin. Time to go to your new bedroom. We'll walk you up. Trapped by his own bravado, Anton had no choice but to lead the procession. The group of men, some stumbling, made their way out of the sitting room, up the grand staircase to the second floor, and down a long, dark hallway. They stopped in front of a heavy, ancient-looking wooden door. This was it. The forbidden room. Anton nervously fumbled with the old iron key he had retrieved. He put it in the lock and turned it. The mechanism groaned in protest, but it opened. Before pushing the door open, he turned to look at his friends one last time, a silent plea in his eyes. He was hoping they would let him off the hook. But they just stared back, their faces a mixture of curiosity and drunken amusement. They weren't backing down. Go on, one of them urged. Anton sighed, turned back to the door, and pushed it open. He and his friends peered inside. For the first time, Anton laid eyes on the room he had avoided for so long. It was anticlimactic. It was just a bedroom, filled with old, heavy furniture that was covered in a thick layer of dust and draped with cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. It was creepy, but it just looked like an old, unused room. All right, get in there, his friend said, nudging him forward. Anton gave them a weak smile. Okay, I'll see you all in the morning, he said, trying to sound confident. He stepped over the threshold into the dusty room. He then pulled the door shut behind him. His friends on the other side heard the distinct sound of the key turning in the lock. Anton was locking himself in for the night. Satisfied, his friends all walked back down the hall to their own guest rooms and went to sleep. Several hours later, in the dead of night, the silence of the castle was shattered. A terrible, blood-curdling scream ripped through the air. It was a sound of pure terror, and it was clearly coming from the haunted bedroom where Anton was sleeping. His friends were jolted awake. They scrambled out of their beds and ran into the hallway, their hearts pounding. They rushed down the hall to the locked door and started banging on it, yelling Anton's name. They tried the handle, but it was locked solid, just as he had left it. Anton! Are you okay? Open the door, they shouted. But there was no response. The screaming had stopped as abruptly as it had started. Now, there was only a dead, heavy silence coming from inside the room. A wave of dread washed over them. The drunken dare didn't seem so funny anymore. That scream had sounded real. It was the sound of someone in mortal danger. Something was terribly wrong. They had to get in there. They threw their shoulders against the heavy oak door, but it wouldn't budge. They took a few steps back and rammed it together, again and again. The old wood splintered and groaned until finally, with a loud crack, the door flew off its hinges and crashed into the room. They stumbled inside, their eyes frantically searching the darkness. And then they saw him. The sight that met them was one they would never forget. Anton was lying on the bed, flat on his back. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling with a look of unimaginable horror frozen on his face. He was dead. As they cautiously approached the bed, they saw the only sign of what might have happened to him. Around his neck, there was a thin, red line. It looked like a ligature mark, the kind of mark left by a rope or a wire. But there was no rope. There was no wire. There was nothing in the room that could have made such a mark. The windows were sealed shut from years of neglect. The door had been locked from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle. Nothing was out of place, except for Anton, lying dead on the bed with that inexplicable red line around his throat. The authorities were called, and they conducted a thorough investigation. They searched the room from top to bottom. They confirmed what the friends already knew. The room had been sealed from the inside. There was no way anyone could have gotten in or out. They never found any kind of rope, cord, or weapon that could have caused the mark on Anton's neck. An autopsy was performed, but the medical examiner was baffled. They couldn't determine a cause of death. He hadn't been poisoned, and there were no other injuries. He was just dead. The case was a complete mystery. But it becomes even stranger when you learn the full story of the hooded monk, not just the watered-down version Anton used to tell at parties. The complete legend, passed down for centuries, was much more specific. The story went that an evil monk had been executed in that very room hundreds of years ago, and his vengeful spirit remained, forever, trapped inside. The legend also contained a specific warning. If anyone dared to spend the night in that room, the ghost of the monk would appear and strangle them to death with a thin rope. The thin red mark found on Anton Holberg's neck was a perfect match for the legend's description. To this day, his death remains officially unexplained. A young man who died alone, in a locked room, seemingly at the hands of a ghost. Our final story takes us back to the very beginning of the 20th century, to southeastern Wales. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, the 20th of January, 1907, a 57-year-old salt merchant named Samuel Hughes was dozing off on a passenger train. Sam was bone-tired. He had been working for nearly 24 hours straight. He had left his home in the small town of Blackwood early the previous morning and taken the train an hour south to the larger town of Newport, where he conducted most of his business. He had spent all of Saturday, from dawn until late into the night, meeting with clients and managing his accounts. Now, finally, he was on the last train home. He could barely keep his eyes open, his head lolling with the rhythm of the train. All he could think about was getting home, greeting his wife, and collapsing into his own warm bed. He had made this trip hundreds of times. He knew the route by heart. Even in his exhausted state, he could feel the train begin to slow down, and his body knew it was time. On autopilot, he gathered his bags, stood up, and shuffled out of his carriage and onto the platform. The train hissed and then pulled away, its red lights disappearing into the dark. Sam stood on the platform for a moment, waiting for the familiar sight of his local station. But, as his tired eyes adjusted, a cold dread washed over him. This wasn't his station. This wasn't Blackwood. In his exhausted stupor, he had gotten off the train one stop too early. He let out a groan of frustration. The train was gone. This was 1907. There wouldn't be another one until morning. He didn't have a phone to call a cab. He was stranded, in the middle of the night, in a town he didn't recognize. He had two choices. He could try to find an inn and spend the night, or he could try to walk home. He wasn't even sure how far away Blackwood was from here. First things first, he needed to find someone to ask for help. He stepped off the deserted platform and started walking towards a few faint lights he could see in the distance. He didn't have high hopes of finding anyone out and about at this hour, in what was clearly a very small rural town. But to his surprise, he hadn't walked for more than a few minutes when he saw another person approaching an intersection up ahead. As they got closer, he saw the uniform and realized it was a police officer on his nightly patrol. A wave of relief washed over Sam. He flagged the officer down. The officer was a bit suspicious at first, seeing a well-dressed man with luggage wandering around in the middle of the night. Sam quickly explained his foolish mistake, how he'd gotten off the train at the wrong stop. He asked the officer if there was a place to stay nearby, or if it was possible to walk to Blackwood. The officer was friendly and helpful. He told Sam that there were a couple of inns in town, but if he was feeling up to it, Blackwood was only about an hour's walk away. The officer said if it were him, he'd probably just make the walk and get home. Sam thought about it. As tired as he was, the thought of sleeping in his own bed was too tempting. He decided to walk. He asked the officer for directions. The officer explained that it was a straight shot. He just needed to follow the main road for about an hour. He would eventually come to a bridge. Once he crossed that bridge, he would see signs for Blackwood. It was simple. Sam thanked the officer profusely, picked up his bags, and set off down the dark road, heading for home. Several hours later, a little after 3 in the morning, Sam's wife Bess was wide awake in their home in Blackwood. She was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out into the darkness. She was worried. She knew Sam had a long day, but he should have been home by now. He was usually very predictable. For him to be this late without any word was highly unusual, and a knot of anxiety was tightening in her stomach. She sat there, listening to the old house creak and groan, her mind imagining all sorts of terrible things that could have happened. And then she heard it. It was Sam's voice, calling out her name from outside. Bess. "I'm home!" It sounded like he was just out front. He must have seen the lights on in the house and known she was waiting up for him. Bess was overcome with relief. He was safe. Her husband was home. She grabbed a candle, her hands trembling slightly, and hurried to the front door to let him in. She unlatched the door and pulled it open, a happy greeting on her lips. But the words died in her throat. It wasn't her husband. Sam was nowhere in sight. Instead, standing on her porch, just inches away from her, was a dark figure. It was tall and cloaked in black, and it was just standing there, silent and still, looking right at her. Bess froze. But strangely, she wasn't afraid. A bizarre sense of calm washed over her as she looked at this strange apparition. She didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but she felt no sense of threat. She just stood there, holding her candle, staring at the figure. And as she looked closer, she noticed a detail. On its head, the figure was wearing a black silk hat. Her husband Sam owned a hat just like it. In fact, he wore it almost every day. She knew for a fact he had been wearing it that morning when he left for Newport. She stared at this figure, wearing what looked like her husband's hat, and remembered hearing her husband's voice just moments before. She didn't imagine it. He had called to her. And then, Bess blinked. And in that instant, the figure was gone. It had simply vanished. The hat, the cloak, all of it. Her porch was empty. Now, the fear hit her. The calm was gone, replaced by a chilling terror. Had she imagined it all? What was happening? She thought maybe Sam was outside, hurt. Maybe he had called to her and then collapsed. She ran out of the house, holding her candle, and started searching the property, calling his name over and over. But Sam wasn't there. After a frantic search, she went back inside, her mind reeling. She sat up for a few more hours, waiting and watching, but Sam never came home. Eventually, exhausted and confused, she went to bed. When Bess woke up late the next afternoon, Sam still wasn't home. The bright sunlight made the strange vision from the night before seem even more unreal. She told herself she must have been half asleep, that she had dreamt the whole thing. Sam was fine, she reassured herself. He probably just got delayed in Newport and would be home soon. As she was trying to convince herself that everything was okay, she heard a sharp knock on the front door. For a moment, her heart leaped with hope. Maybe it was Sam. She rushed to the door and opened it. It was a police officer, the same one who had spoken to Sam the night before. He had a grim expression on his face, and he removed his helmet. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I have some terrible news." He explained what had happened. The night before, Sam had followed his directions, walking along the dark road towards Blackwood. He had made it all the way to the bridge that the officer had told him about. He was so close to home. But somehow, either because he was so exhausted or because it was so dark, he had made a fatal misstep. He had fallen from the bridge. His body had been discovered that morning. As Bess listened, her world collapsing around her, Her mind inexplicably flashed back to the dark figure on her porch. Without thinking, she asked the officer a strange question. "What time do you think he died?" The officer paused, a bit taken aback, but then he answered. He said that based on when he had spoken to Sam and how long the walk to the bridge would have taken, they estimated that he likely fell sometime around 3 in the morning. The time was a perfect match. That was right around when she had heard Sam's voice and seen the figure. And then she thought of the hat. That distinct black silk hat. She had to know. Her voice was barely a whisper when she asked, "When you found him, was he wearing his hat?" The officer looked confused by the question, but answered it. "No, ma'am," he said. "He wasn't wearing a hat at all. We couldn't find one at the scene." In that moment, Bess knew. As heartbreaking as it was, she knew exactly what she had seen on her porch. It hadn't been a dream or a figment of her imagination. Who or what she saw, the dark figure in the cloak wearing her husband's black silk hat, had been Sam's spirit. He had fallen from the bridge and died, and his soul had come home one last time to say goodbye. The figure wearing his hat was his way of letting her know it was really him. Bess would go on to tell her story to a local reporter, and the tale of the ghostly goodbye was printed in newspapers all across Wales, a haunting reminder that sometimes love is strong enough to cross even the final boundary between life and death. The strange thing about stories like these is that no matter how much evidence you uncover, one piece never seems to fit. A ghost seen at the exact moment of death. A locked room with no escape. A figure returning home after falling into darkness. Maybe some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Thanks for watching, and if you're brave enough for one more story tonight, there's a playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time.